Good. Well, thank you, Cassia and Ted, and thanks to all of you who got up on what feels like the first winter morning in D.C. today. Mr. Secretary, you and I have known each other since we were children, practically, a long time. Yeah. And so it's a real treat to be here to have this conversation with you, and we appreciate your taking time from your role as leadership of the Brazil delegation to the IMF and World Bank meetings this week to spend a few minutes with us. So I'd like to get right into some questions. You've got a really exciting portfolio for those of us who have followed Brazil-U.S. relations for a long time. And over these past decades, we have frequently had hopes for a bilateral Brazil-U.S. free trade agreement. Now we have this new strong alignment between our two governments, and those hopes have risen again. In fact, we're hearing that the two countries may be working on a non-traditional free trade agreement. So could you tell us what that kind of a non-traditional agreement might look like?
Well, first of all, Donna, my pleasure to be here with you. It is true we've known each other for a long time, although you are not the only friend I have in this room. There are so many of them. There are at least two that I'd like to acknowledge. Of course, Ted Helms, with whom I had the opportunity to interact when I was living in New York and working at Columbia University, and Ambassador Nestor Foster, the Brazilian embassy here in Washington. Well, yes, it is true. There are many stars aligned at present. And it's true if you look at the trajectory of Brazil-U.S. relations, that some stars have also been aligned in the past. For example, I remember in the second half of the 1990s, there was a great personal relationship between President Fernando Henrique Cardoso and President Clinton. But then the legal and political framework for example, trade relations to move to the next level were not there. The Clinton presidency was never granted trade promotion authority by Congress. And this is something that's very specific and brings us a great sense of momentum of the current status of the relations between the White House and Congress, because the White House does enjoy trade promotion authority status all the way to 2021. And on top of that, there is this great vibe, there's this great connection between President Bolsonaro and President Trump, which really opens the gate for us to move our relationship to our next level. I think traditionally there's also been some sort of difference in terms of views on how to approach this. I think the U.S. tradition has been more in the sense that we should move step by step and perhaps remove some of the smaller obstacles that are standing in the way. When it comes to trade, I think the technical term to call it is the trade irritant. So if you move ahead in overcoming the trade irritants, then you can go for something that is more comprehensive. Although I personally feel that we need a vision. We need something that is ambitious, and because the vision is there and because the vision is shared, then the relative scope, the relative importance of the smaller trader issues must be judged in light of what's going to come next. And I think the concrete experience of this first 9 months is that we're pursuing, actually, we're making progress on both fronts. President Trump, on numerous occasions, has voiced the U.S. intention to negotiate a trade deal with Brazil. The same is also true on our part. We're making progress in some of those trade irritants, ethanol, wheat. There's also the bigger picture approach that, for example, is provided by the U.S. voice in support for Brazil's accession to the OECD. So it's a great momentum for the relationship, not only in terms of, once again, the personal connection between the two heads of state, but also in terms of the framework that's involving all this. So we're very optimistic. We're making giant strides forward. And this sort of is a kind of getting back to the underperformance that has really characterized Brazil-U.S. relations in the past. I mean, we're talking about the two biggest democracies of the West, the two biggest economies of the hemisphere, and their commercial exchange should be at a much higher level, more intense. Even if you judge by the aspects of other successful examples in the past 70 years. It is very difficult for one to find out there one single country that has reason to prominence, to prosperity, without having a special relationship with the United States. So this is what we're trying to accomplish.
Made a couple of very important points there from my own observation, and I think Tony Harrington saw this too when he was at the embassy. We often had, several times, had a really good top-to-top relationship, be it Fernando Henrique or Bill Clinton, or even Lula and George W. Bush. What we didn't have was the infrastructure to support that relationship, and you know, the mattress mice here in Washington can often undermine those intentions. The second point you made was the important role of Congress in all of this, and this is an area where I've often said the bar for Brazil is very high in Congress, and I think that Brazil has to do more to market its brand within the U.S. Congress, establish those relationships, get members of Congress down to Brazil to see what's really happening. Is that part of your strategy?
This is more of a foreign affairs approach under my purview, which is more the trade policy and the attraction of FDI. Yes, we try to establish these connections with Congress. I think there's a new Brazil emerging, and so therefore the communication challenge is central. We have to communicate ourselves better, and that includes communicating with the different sectors of America's polity, and therefore Congress. We must do more, no doubt, no doubt. I think it's funny because there's a kind of two-layered perception out there. There's perhaps some criticism or lack of understanding of what's happening in Brazil, particularly given the kind of interlocutors Brazil has had in the past and the roadways that they have made in terms of global opinion public making. But there's also the sense that there's a series of activities today, particularly in terms of economic reform, pension reform, the Federative Pact, the concessions, privatizations, bringing down the relative size of government in the economy and opening up the economy, that as a whole actually constitute perhaps what could be best described as the most comprehensive and ambitious structural reform process in motion in the world today. And by saying this, I'm basically cloning a friend of mine who lives here in Washington. I'm not sure whether he's in the room. I'm not going to say who he is. But it is true. I mean, it's a very comprehensive agenda, and I think little by little this perception is setting in. It's going to be very good for Brazil, and for those who are ahead of the curve and can see that first. And I think members of Congress should be those. They will also be able to play a very constructive role in this new phase of Brazil-U.S. relations.
Let's talk about that foreign direct investment you mentioned, if we can. I had the privilege of participating last week at the Brazil Investment Forum, and congratulations, I think it was. I participated in all of them. This was by far the best in terms of attracting a really broad cross-section of companies, of potential investors, companies from around the world. Yeah. When you talk to those investors, either those already in Brazil or in particular potential investors, what do they tell you are the most important considerations as they make decisions about Brazil? Yeah.
That's a very good question, Donna. I'd just like to perhaps spend some time before I go into the specific clarifications that you have brought up that has to do with the very nature of FDI into Brazil, right? Because Brazil's industrial model from the 50s all the way to the recent Lula-Dilma years, and especially between 2003 and 2015, were very much marked by what I like to call an import substitution industrialization 2.0, right? So it's sort of a going back to the idea that government should be the most important player in terms of shaping demand, and therefore, if you want to attract FDI based upon local content rules, then protectionist barriers have to be set up very high. There has to be very strong regulation, and as an award, those investors who set up operations in Brazil will be able to practice local prices that are much higher than the average multinational companies would exercise in other markets. So it's very much based upon the exceptionality of Brazil and the short-term games of import substitution. And year after year, Brazil has been figuring in the 5-6 top destinations for FDI in the world for the quote-unquote wrong reasons, right?
Remember Informatica?
Oh, I remember, for example, there was this automaker firm from Germany, And I spoke to one of their executives some 15 years ago, said, yes, of course we're setting up operations in Brazil. I mean, if we sell our most basic model in Germany for 17,000 euro, and we can do the very same thing by selling it in Brazil for 35,000 if we manufacture it locally, why not set up operations in Brazil? So you do have FDI for the wrong reasons, right? I mean, look at Petrobras with all of this local content craze during the Lula-Dilma years. If you go out in the world to buy one of those Aframax vessels, I think the price tag, if you buy one in South Korea or Japan, China, is about $50 million. Petrobras at one point was purchasing each of those for 125 million if 70% of the vessel were produced in Brazil. So it doesn't make any sense economically, and you do so for the sake of local jobs, local generation. But at the end of the day, what you have is something that has no economic logic, and therefore you sacrifice both jobs and tax revenue. So we're changing that. I think the model now has much more to do with the integration into global supply chains. As a matter of fact, I think one of the most important collateral effects of the EU-Mercosur agreement is not necessarily related to trade, but it will help change the nature of FDI into Brazil. Because, say, you're a Japanese firm and you're thinking about setting up operations in Mercosur, in Brazil. The way you thought of this strategically is that if you're there, your roof is 3% of the global market because that's the share occupied by Mercosur countries. But once you have the Mercosur-European Union agreement, you establish operations in Brazil. Not only do you cater to the local market or to the regional market, but you can also establish an investment dialogue, a production dialogue with that which is in its entirety is the world's top GDP. So there's a change in the very nature of the FDI that's going to Brazil right now. It's not only about the relative big dimension of the domestic market, but also a further connection to global supply chains. And of course, if you want to take full benefit of that, coming to your point, we're going to have to do other things. So we're going to have to make the tax simpler and perhaps lower as an overall percentage of GDP. We are going to have to make it a lot less complicated, and that's why I think we are so focused on the so-called Federative Pact. It's not only about tax reform; it's about the Federative Pact. It is as if the tax reform was one room in a bigger building of Federative Pact, which is something that's really going to level the playing field in Brazil. It's something that we're trying to accomplish. By the way, after the EU-Mercosur agreement, a lot of people came to me and asked, Marcos, what is the next big agreement that Brazil is going to conclude? Is it going to be Japan? Is it going to be the U.S.? And what I always say is that the most important trade and investment agreement that Brazil should strive for is an agreement with itself, right? Brazil has to have an agreement with itself. If we harmonize the domestic conditions for Brazil to compete internationally, I think in the mid-run, this represents much more of a boost to Brazil's economic growth prospects than international agreements with any other country in the world.
It's actually a good message for many countries.
Yeah, well.
So for several years, you headed the BRICS lab at Columbia University. From an economic point of view, is it still relevant for Brazil to be the B in BRICS?
Well, Brazil is very relevant.
Is that membership important?
Yeah. It's just that, I mean, I think there's been done a kind of metamorphosis of the concept of BRICS over the years, because when it first surfaced in 2001, it did so as of the, say, crystal ball of Goldman Sachs and Jim O'Neill, and it was very much about a prospective study on how what the world would look like in terms of shares of global GDP, right? So he was once again, he was looking at the crystal ball and he was saying, well, these countries have big territory, big populations, they have the conditions to play regional leadership, and therefore there is going to be a bigger and bigger slice of the pie going to these countries, and these countries are Brazil, Russia, and China, right? So it was about economic growth, it was about the relative size of global GDP, And I think it was also about wrapping it all up with some asset classes that could be presented to investors. So this is what I call BRICS 1.0, right? Then there is BRICS 2.0, which is some of the leaders of these nations a couple of years ago decided that this was a good concept to build upon. And therefore, it became a sort of institution building process with the contingency reserve arrangement so that these countries can fight liquidity crisis together, and the setup of the new development bank, right, in which Brazil has 20% share. So BRICS 2.0 became about institution building. So in certain areas, it makes sense. For example, when you talk about IMF or World Bank reform, or that the so-called emerging countries should have a bigger say in how this governance is organized. There's the issue of international development for finance, and perhaps here the new development bank can be an important vehicle. So for the future, it's going to depend very much on what you want to do with the group, right? I like very much the concept of smart BRICS, right? Because there are very important infrastructure challenges around the world, not only in terms of 20th century infrastructure, but infrastructure for cognitive technologies, for clean energies, for what you could say what you could call 21st century infrastructure. And it is a basic fact to realize that China is one of the most important providing centers for liquidity in the world. And if you think in terms of more of a prospective approach, most likely the U.S. along with China and India will be the top 3 global GDPs in years to come. So it also makes sense, I guess, to be part of BRICS and to build this update on the concept of BRICS so that Brazil can be a part of this club where so much of the global economy is going to be focused on.
I think you've done more thinking about that from your position in Colombia than a lot of people have. It shows. Yeah. What
I think is wrong, perhaps, is I don't like there are things that people take it as automatic. So Brazil was growing at one point. Oh, it's always going to be like that. Or China is growing. It's always going to be like that. Okay, there are trends, but it's very much what these countries do domestically, right? How they adapt to the changing contours of globalization that will be responsible, at the end of a cycle for their success. So there's nothing automatic there. Now, one thing that is true, and I like to highlight this very much, this is bigger than BRICS, is that we've grown very used to the concept of the G7, but it is also true that out there now you have the E7, right? The non-mature, very important big economies of the emerging world. Mm-hmm. And both in terms of nominal GDP and relative economic influence, it is true that there is some sort of rebalancing, and the E7 will more and more play a bigger role when compared to the traditional G7. And I think this is really something extraordinary that Brazil has, because by the whole process of acceding to the OECD and by being a member of the OECD, or this concept that I'm describing here, the E7, Brazil has a foot in each of both platforms, right? So it is there with the OECD, where standards are set up and they're very important. They're key to Brazil. But it is also part of this other, say, grouping where much of economic, or much of the engine of economic growth will be ranging in the next couple of years.
There was, toward the end of last week, at least in the Brazilian media, sort of a dust-up about Brazil's OECD membership and the extent of U.S. support for that application. Are you satisfied with the follow-up you're getting to President Trump's commitment in March to support Brazil's membership?
I mean, the U.S. government is supporting Brazil's accession. They have formalized it at the highest level. We understand that this is a process. There's some homework that Brazil has to do. There's some organizing that the organization, the OECD, has to accomplish itself. It's a process. It's a very good process, and we're happy with where it's going, and we're very thankful of the U.S. support.
I think it is impossible to talk about BRICS without mentioning China, and you did mention them specifically, and particularly as President Bolsonaro gets ready for his first trip to China, as well as it's worthwhile mentioning Japan and the Middle East. There has been considerable Chinese investment in Brazil over the past several years in really key sectors of the infrastructure, right, in electricity, ports, energy. What does Brazil want from its economic relationship with China?
Well, I think it's also true with relations with any other country in the world. We want things that are mutually beneficial. We want to retain sovereignty. We want to be partners. But it is also true, Donna, that in the recent, I mean, sometimes, and I was talking to the ambassador here driving to the U.S. chamber today. Sometimes we use words that do not necessarily reflect the reality on the ground, right? So, for example, sometimes you use partnership when in reality what you have is a customer-provider relationship. It's more of a client. For example, Brazil's trade with China, the trade flows are north of $100 billion today, right? But when you compare to other areas, the relationship is relatively still, it has a long way to go. Right. So if you really want to move from this clientele relationship to something that is bigger, there has to be more on the table. And I think one of the reasons why President Bolsonaro is going to China now is to discuss these opportunities. But I think President Bolsonaro has really given us a very strong direction in the sense that we should do business with any country in the world without any kind of ideological biases there. The national interest is the compass guiding us, and we're also we learn from the experience of other countries. For example, today there's a standoff between China and the U.S., but it is also true that China is the top destination for American FDI. The U.S. is the top destination for Chinese FDI, and if you want to use the term trade partners, the U.S. is the top trading partner of China. China is the top trading partner of the U.S. So there is an interdependence out there that's very important. We don't have that much interdependence with China right now. We have more commercial relations. It is true. Chinese FDI into Brazil is picking up, but it still has a long way to go. Brazil will always retain its sovereignty, its national interest, but also a very pragmatic approach is what should characterize Brazil's relationship with China or any other country in the world.
When we were working with the B20 in Argentina last year, the business equivalent of the G20, which Argentina was hosting, our maybe most robust debate came around the issue of state-owned enterprises in China. And SOEs do dominate in China. So doesn't China need to be treated differently from other potential sources of investment and other trade partners? Well,
China has its own model of economic growth. It's also undergoing some DNA change. I think the way that they have risen from a very low-income country in the late 1970s to the economic superpower that they are today is changing. China is no longer a low-cost country. China is moving, as we all know, head-to-head with many of the most developed countries in the world in areas of technology. And they're also shifting their SOEs. We understand that there may be some unfair practices and some way of organizing their strategy that is not coherent with standards that we apply in the West. We are mindful of those, and we should, on a case-by-case basis, judge our relations with whenever a Chinese SOE is at play, and it involves a Brazilian interest.
When you took on this new position at the beginning of the year, I'm sure you set out some priorities for yourself and for your team, and you've been in the job for 10 months now.
Right.
Can you tell us what those top priorities have been and how you've been making progress against them?
Well, Donna, I think we had a very good diagnosis because Minister Paulo Guedes and President Bolsonaro, I mean, they've adopted a clear agenda. So it's a five-fold agenda. So pension reform, the Federative Pact, privatizations, reducing the relative size of state in the economy, and opening up the economy. It's just that sometimes we use this opening up sentence, and in reality, you're using them to describe a challenge that's much more sophisticated, and it has to do with Brazil's integration in the global economy, Brazil's insertion in the global economy. And then the diagnosis we've had is basically sat upon three pillars. One, countries that have reason have institutions and strategy. So perhaps Brazil has made great way forward in terms of institutions, but not so much in terms of strategy. These successful countries have placed a very strong emphasis on foreign trade. It's the case of Japan, Germany, China, Chile, Spain. It's not the case of Brazil. So traditionally, it's very tough to find one particular historical spot in Brazil in which trade plus exports or plus imports represent more than 25% of Brazil's GDP. So a very timid player in terms of trade flows. That's been Brazil's history. And another problem, which was very immediate in nature, the sphere of macroeconomics policy and the sphere of trade policy in Brazil have always been divorced, right? So from the last to the first, we did away with the partitions that used to separate, say, the former ministries of finance and industry and trade. So it's now everything under one very same rule. So we have brought trade policy to the core of macroeconomic policy. Two of the very concrete results of this doing away with the partitions is the way we have fast-forwarded into the EU-Mercosur agreement. In the words, for example, of an European negotiator, she said, Brazil has made more, we have made more progress in negotiations in the first 6 months leading up to June 28th when the agreement was concluded than in the previous 20 years. So this was very important. As per structure, and I was also discussing with the ambassador this morning, we have this board of trade, the so-called CAMEX, right? Which is an important body in deciding tariffs and quota and trade defense-related measures, but that lacked in terms of strategy. So now with the setup of the Strategic Council for Trade Policy, Brazil is going to be able to translate what the national interest means in terms of a trade policy towards India, trade policy towards 5G, trade policy towards AI, trade policy towards Belt and Road, trade policy towards the U.S. So, there's a strategic element that was lacking in Brazil is also now part of the structure, and I think this is a very welcome addition to the institutional picture in Brazil. And, of course, there are the more immediate challenges, right? For example, what Mercosur is going to look like after elections in Argentina. What should a trade policy to sub-Saharan Africa be shaped from now on? What is the focus that we're going to give to Southeast Asia? Because there's something that's very important surfacing, Donna, in the world today, which is the rerouting of global supply chains. So since China is no longer a low-cost country, many of the manufacturing hubs that were once housed in China have been shifting towards countries in China's geoeconomic vicinity. And that's bringing about major GDP increases in nations like Vietnam and Indonesia and Myanmar and even India. And the fact is that GDP per capita in these countries is relatively low, right? $3,500. And when you experience this much growth in such a short period of time, as of such low GDP per capita basis, most of the incremental income is directed to the consumption of calories. You eat more and you invest more in infrastructure. So that represents an extraordinary opportunity for countries like Brazil, because they are, in fact, going to structurally change the global demand map for both agricultural and mineral commodities and for food, right? And therefore, this is a great opportunity for Brazil. It has to be out there. So we're also trying to divert part of our strategy towards that phenomenon and how much it can represent, including in terms of partnerships with the U.S. The joint ventures that we can set up in areas such as food
or aerospace.
Or aerospace. The partnership is already there.
One out of
Thanks
the blue.
also to you. so that these two great nations can hand in hand take advantage of these opportunities that are popping up out there.
I'm glad you talked about strategy in particular. I think that's very gratifying to many of us who have heard in this town for decades that the problem with Brazil is Brazil doesn't know what it wants. Well, if you have a strategy, you have a clear trade policy, you know what you want and you're going to go out after it.
Yeah, I mean, I've studied this topic very much. It's not only a question of your will or your willingness to set up a strategy, but you have to have the template. You have to have the vehicle. And now with this new council that's going to be headed by the president, which in its own sake has a great symbolic value, we'll be able to fill that gap of strategy devising that is so central to countries that are successful in terms of trade.
So when we first met, the positions were reversed. You were in the private sector and I was in government.
Right.
But we were both observing the private sector. I think you were at Gazette Mercantile when I first met you, actually, writing for them at least back in the day. And most of this room, of course, is filled with people from the private sector. So what do you see as the role of the private sector in helping Brazil achieve its objectives in trade, both the Brazilian private sector and multinationals?
Well, the role is pushing governments to do the right thing. and the right thing here is more trade with the U.S., more investment flows, pushing. I've talked about the big vision and the importance of having like this macro objectives when it comes to Brazil-U.S. relations, and I think they're important because they help sort out the short-term stuff. But the short-term stuff is also very important. We're talking about the bilateral treaty in terms of tax. We're talking about trade facilitation. We're talking about the regulatory convergence. These are all areas in which the private sector has a major role to play. But I think my take is that the private sector has been playing that role.
You think they're stepping up?
Yes, and not only in recent years, but I mean for quite a long time. It was government, and particularly the Brazilian government, that was not seizing upon the opportunity of having a special relationship with this country.
Can we focus on Latin America for a minute? In particular, you mentioned Mercosur, and I think a lot of us are concerned about what might happen October 27th in Argentina, and even more importantly, after October 27th. But the possibility of alliances between Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance countries, and really increasing intra-Latin America trade. New trade agreement with Mexico and Brazil, right? Can you talk a little bit about your relations with your neighbors?
Yeah, well, Donna, there's a challenge that no doubt has a lot to do with trade, but it is also true that in terms of complementarities, perhaps some of the most attractive opportunities do not immediately reside in our neighborhood. Of course, we want to do more trade with all of our neighbors, but once again, in terms of the traditional Ricardian view of comparative advantages, maybe the top strategy here would be to unite efforts in order to take advantage and to seize upon opportunities that are in other parts of the world, where I think the regional cooperation is lacking, and where there's also a great opportunity to be tapped into is in terms of attracting investment for infrastructure, right? Because to no one's secret, there's a lot of resources out there that are looking for good infrastructure opportunities, especially in a world where interest rates are so low, and therefore there's abundant liquidity looking for opportunities that can bring a greater gain, not only in terms of market access or access to natural resources, but also in terms of having your capital remunerated over time. And I think it would be also a consensus that one of the regions of the world that presents this combination is market access to natural resources, the need for infrastructure that can be profitable over the years is South America, particularly South America. And again, we have in the past made some progress in terms of regional cooperation. But for example, having the Brazilian government go hand in hand with the government of Chile or of Argentina to liquidity centers around the world to present for infrastructure opportunities that are transnational in nature. For example, there's always this talk about the so-called bioceanic railroad. So depending on the way you set up the blueprint, it involves what, 5 countries? Because it may involve Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia, even Bolivia. So you sort out also historical problems because these 2 countries are landlocked. They do not have direct access to the sea. And then you go out into the Pacific region. You can even have one stream going out through Chile, the other one going out through Peru.
Right.
And I don't remember, sincerely, I do not remember one single opportunity in which leaders of these countries have sat down to say, well, let us work on one single project that we are going to present jointly to investors around the world. So this coordination, cooperation in terms of having single projects to be presented at a priority level to investors around the world is something that is lacking and that we're trying to accomplish. For example, the last time I was in one of these Mercosur meetings during the Santa Fe summit a couple of months ago, this was one of the decisions. It's going to be very much pending on what comes out of Argentina's ballot box later in the month.
Do we need to end this now, Cassia? I'm concerned where we are on agenda. I think I'm getting signals from the Brazil team. Yeah, okay. Any last words you'd like to leave us with?
No, we are very optimistic. I think Brazil is making progress. I also want to once again highlight that we are players, we are actors in, once again, this process of structural transformation in Brazil that is acknowledged by many as the most ambitious in the world. I think there's going to be a before and after this administration. The after is going to be better than the before, and this is what we're working for. Okay, so thank you very much.
I think I can say we have friends here
Yeah.
that support that.
One thing, Donna.
Yeah.
When I said hi to everyone, I forgot to acknowledge the presence of a very important player in this role, the president of BNDES, Gustavo Montezano, who's over here, okay?
Oh,
My friend, who's really revamping the bank.
Yes, absolutely.